Hi folks, welcome to RJA Impact. Today we're going to be talking about the goings on in the current week of the Kristin Smart, Ruben Flores, Paul Flores trial, commencing the 29th of August 2022. And as a reminder, Kristin Smart went missing 26 years ago and Paul Flores has been charged with her murder. His father, Ruben, has been charged with helping Paul cover up the crime. On Monday, the first witness was Edward Chadwell. He's a contractor and actually built Ruben Flores' house in 1991 for Ruben and his then wife Susan. And this is key because it's one of the places that the prosecutors say Kristin's body has been hidden at some time over the past 26 years. From what we heard, he was quite hands-on and worked quite extensively on the project himself. And he was asked by Pouvril whether he or his team found any buried bodies when building the property. No, they didn't. Also, were there any injuries to you or your crew? And there weren't. Were there any bodies, primates, monkeys or ferrets in the ground during construction that were found? And no, there weren't. Did you use pink nylon twine to lay lines for the masonry? Yes, he used twine for everything, but didn't recall which colour. This was actually asked by Sanger for the defence, and he held up a spool of pink twine and asked Ed if it was similar to what he used, and he said yes. Now, this whole exchange is quite key, as it's believed that evidence relating to fibres being found in the ground are going to be brought into evidence as potentially belonging to Kristin or her clothes. Then this string is going to provide an alternative source for those fibres, in my opinion anyway. Misik for the defence asked him about his team and how many people helped him build the deck, and it was just two, his son and his brother. And Ed said, also me, I'm the carpenter. And Sanger asked, did the three of you build the retaining wall under the deck? And Ed said yes. I just give those couple of exchanges in as examples, but there were lots of questions by both the prosecution and defence on how deep the footings were. Did they dig down to bedrock, etc., etc.? Now, these didn't seem to lead anywhere to me, at least, and in the moment anyway. So we then had our second witness, David Stone. David was Ruben's tenant who stayed with him for about 10 years, from 2010 to 2020. He rented a room and it transpired that his bedroom door led out onto a deck area. Pouvril asked him if he'd ever heard anything about Kristin Smart during his time there, and David responded that he had heard the name. Did anyone else besides Ruben go under the deck during the 10 years you lived there? No. And we heard of an instance where a plumber could have gone under the deck to sort out a problem, but Ruben wouldn't let him. And another example, when he'd moved a few empty plastic 55-gallon drums into the space under the deck, Ruben was angry. He hadn't asked for permission, and ultimately Ruben made him move the drums. And he'd also heard Ruben referring to Kristin as an expletive SLUT. And across, Misik asked him whether he'd asked Paul, his son, to fix the plumbing and therefore it might have saved some money, therefore not using the plumber, and it could have done. Now, we got back to the evidence on what Ruben had been calling Kristin, and Pouvril asked him again about this, and he responded, I only heard Kristin, no last name, and effing SLUT. And he said he'd heard the slur once. Now, this caused some kind of hiatus for Pouvril, who looked very confused and took a very long pause. And what happened then was that Pouvril excused David for the time being and then called in Clint Cole, who was a detective and worked in the St. Louis Obispo's sheriff's office. Did he speak with David, and was the interview audio recorded? And yes, he did, and yes, it was. And in that interview, did David tell you that Ruben always called Kristin Smart a dirty SLUT? He did. After clearing that up, he was then excused and we had David back. So then we had Sanger for the defence. Was the billboard up the whole time you were living there? And this is the billboard which is quite famous, which has Kristin as being identified as a missing person with a reward on it. And this was up for years, if not decades, in the area. David responded yes, and did you read about the case online, he was asked, and he said, I've looked it up. And you told law enforcement that the FBI had never searched under the house, but you didn't know that for a fact, did you? And David responded, no, I didn't. We then had our fourth witness, Detective Matt Terrell. He took part in a search of Ruben's house on February the 5th, 2020 and took photos during the search. The teams undertaking the search found several documents, flyers and newspaper articles relating to the case. He said that the search took approximately 2 hours. And Poovrel asked him, "In the bedroom, did you find any items relating to Kristin Smart?" "Yes, we located the said newspaper articles and letters, etc. And here are some of those items, which were all located in Ruben Flores' bedroom. There were some additional items found in a drawer, including an SLO Tribune article about Kristin Smart. There was a poster for a high school Kristin Smart essay contest and handwritten names of winners of that contest." Sanger on cross-examination made the point that the flyers that were found were distributed and used, as he says, aggressively towards Mr. Flores. In other words, creating some interest in the case that Ruben would have, and for keeping some of the related literature. Sanger asked him, "Do you recall the press being present and taking pictures when Ruben Flores was arrested?" And Terrell responded, "I don't recall when the press showed up." And I think here that the defence are making the point that the prosecution, or at least the police services, are somehow complicit in the overall swaying of public opinion against the Floreses, in my opinion anyway. Both Paul and Ruben Flores' defence attorneys indicated that Ruben Flores was the subject of hate mail and harassment, and pointing to some of the items in the search, Misik for Ruben said, "Are you aware that my client has received thousands of pieces of hate mail?" And Terrell responded, "I'm not aware of that." Our last witness on Monday was Jamalyn Holman. She was a neighbour of Ruben and spoke about strange activity taking place during February of 2020. At that time, Ruben and Susan Flores, along with Susan's boyfriend, removed part of a fence and then parked a cargo trailer next to the house, all after dark. She documented how she heard yelling and she saw vehicles outside the Flores home that she hadn't seen before on February the 9th, which was about a week after FBI had searched the home. As well as the cargo trailer, there was also a travel trailer, a red SUV and a white van that all turned up at the property. Some of the yelling appeared to be in respect of trying to back the cargo trailer into the garage, although she couldn't hear the exact words that were being said. Also, she said that Susan Flores' red SUV was seen regularly at Ruben Flores' house at the beginning of 2020, but it's only seen occasionally now. Poovrel asked her, "Are you familiar with the podcast?" And this is referring to Chris Lambert's Your Own Backyard. And yes, she is. Did Susan Flores begin frequenting Ruben Flores' house around the time the podcast was released? Yes, she did. There was quite a heated exchange in the courtroom at one point. Poovrel wanted to show some photos taken by Jamalyn, and Sanger said he wanted to review them, and Poovrel said in turn he'd already provided them. Essentially, Poovrel saying to Sanger, "Look at the copies I've already given you," and Sanger responded, "Mr. Poovrel, you gave us 7 volumes of stuff." And Judge O'Keefe asked to speak with the attorneys in the hallway thereafter, and I think that was fairly well done of the judge, probably de-escalating a slightly fraught situation. Anyway, the photos turned out to be some rather blurry photos of the vehicles at the house, including Susan Flores' red SUV. Apparently, after she'd taken the photos and observed all these goings-on, before she spoke with Detective Cole on the case, she called the podcaster Chris Lambert, and yes, she had messaged him, she responded. Sanger also put it to her that she didn't like Ruben Flores living on her street, did you? And she said, "I had no objection to that." Sanger, "You would just as soon see Ruben Flores live somewhere else." Poovrel objected to this on relevance, which was sustained by the judge. "You believed that they were moving certain evidence out," said Sanger. "I didn't know what they were moving out. I just found it suspicious," said Jamalyn. And that was it for the day. On August the 30th, 2022, our first witness was Senior Sheriff's Deputy Jason Nadal. He was another officer who attended the search on February the 5th, 2020, and we saw some pictures he'd taken during that search. The defence asked, Why were there 8 detectives being used in this search for such a small house? And apparently this was fairly normal. We usually use 8, he responded. Now we heard from Sanger. You also did surveillance in this case. Did you surveil Paul Flores going to his car, leaving for work, coming back home? And Nadal said, I did do that at least one time. Did you put a GPS tracker on his car? Yes, sir, responded Nadal. There was also a camera placed on the telephone pole across the street from Flores' home. Our second witness for the day was Gregory Smith, deputy and detective. He testified about wiretaps that were executed on the phones of the various Flores family members. This was Paul Flores, his father Ruben Flores, his mother Susan Flores, and his sister Ermelinda Thomas. The phone numbers were tapped from January the 6th to February the 4th, 2020. About a month. Apparently, a judge is required to get an update on the case every 5 days in order to grant permission to continue the tapping. One particular conversation between Susan Flores and Paul Flores was played out in court, and they're discussing Chris Lambert's podcast, Your Own Backyard, and we heard Susan saying, the other thing I need you to do is to listen to that podcast so we can punch holes in it wherever we can. And Susan continues, only you can tell me that. Paul didn't respond to this. Then we heard some of the, I guess you'd call it more Machiavellian or sneaky ways the police tried to manipulate things to get the Flores to talk about the case. Apparently one of the sheriff's office's strategies was to leak information about the investigation to Chris Lambert, who could then put it in his podcast, and then that would prompt the Flores families to talk about it on the phone. That is the purpose of a wiretap, he said. Apparently nearly 10,000 phone calls were intercepted in that month period, and that seems astonishing to me. Okay, it was before the time where mobile phones were really prevalent, but 10,000 phone calls? Yes, apparently that's correct. There were 3,447 communications on Paul Flores' phone alone. Sanger honed in on this approach by the police to leak information and mentioned some of the titles of Lambert's podcasts, which were The Only Suspect, Their Own Backyard, Sons of Susan. And Smith said, that sounds right. The focus of a lot of this was on Paul Flores and the Flores family, and Smith responded with, that's accurate. At one point during the cross-examination, Sanger asked Smith if he had heard Paul talk about bringing forth false information once the trial began, and Smith said he hadn't heard that. Again, Sanger asked, in all of these phone calls, there was no indication that this family was making up a story or telling lies, right? Pouvrel objected, and the judge sustained it. Sanger again, you didn't hear my client say he was going to make up a story, and Smith said no. Pouvrel highlighted something quite key in respect of the phone call when he asked, is the only time Paul Flores does not respond to Susan Flores is when she says to him, you're the one that can tell me. And Smith responded, that's correct. We had yet another dog handler back after lunch, Christine Black. We heard the similar story about how she trained her dogs, her experience, 22 years. She's trained 5 or 6 dogs over the years, and it was Annie, a 5-year-old Belgian Shepherd, that participated in the search of Ruben Flores' home in Arroyo Grande. And yes, Annie was trained in human remains detection. It was on March the 15th, 2021, when she was called to help out with the search of a house in Arroyo Grande. She met another dog handler, Karen Atkinson, and each of them searched the property with their dogs independently and didn't see what the other was doing, in other words, blind. When Annie searched the backyard of the property, she didn't indicate a change of behaviour in respect of human remains. Then Annie was asked to search underneath the decking area. Here there was one particular area where the dog started to change behaviour in what's called bracketing the area and then vacuuming the scent. However, Annie did not provide a final alert on the area underneath the deck, said Black. Black said that Annie's behaviour was actually consistent with what she would expect to see if the source of the scent had been removed. Sanger, on cross-examination, obviously honed in on this somewhat. You searched around the lattice area from outside but got no alert. She showed no change on the outside, responded Black. Now, although changes in canine behaviour is insufficient according to the standards set by the California Rescue Dog Association, in quotes, change of behaviour is very important for us, Black said. Honing in even further on this, Sanger asked, even a full alert is just an inference, correct? Now, Pouvel objected to this, which was sustained. You're good friends with Adela Morris? Asked Black. We're associates, was the response. Misik on Cross also asked, you found no bones or body parts in this case? And Black responded, no. Misik also asked, dogs are attracted to other dogs, right? Black responded, not during a search. Not even if they're in heat? No. Our first witness on the 31st of August was the other dog handler, Karen Atkinson. Again, we heard all about the certification process and the fact that her dog, Amiga, had never failed a certification test. Amiga was asked to search an area around the backyard, and Amiga didn't alert in the backyard. Amiga was then asked to search underneath the decking. She travelled up the entire side, turned and came back down, and that is where I began to see the change of behaviour. She slowed and worked a circle and studied the ground. At one point, she did 2 or 3 head pops. It was a definite change of behaviour, which tells me she's picking up some level of her target odour. I felt that it warranted mentioning in my report. After this, we had our second witness for the day, Phil Haynes, who's an archaeologist. He's specialised in ground-penetrating radar, GPR, for the last 15 years, and has used them in various archaeological sites and burial locations. We heard a little bit about the technology. As he put it, the unit is transmitting radio waves into the ground, and it measures the time it takes for the wave to return. That tells you where things are not uniform with the surroundings and helps you find anomalies or voids, he said. Apparently, he'd used a 400 MHz antenna in this particular case, and it allowed him to search between 0 and 8 feet underground. Have you ever found a human body with this unit? Yes, quite a few, was his response. A number of grids were set up for testing around the search of the property in Arroyo Grande. Haynes said yes, he believes there were 11, and 4 of these were suggested as locations for excavation, 1, 3, 6 and 10, as you can see here in the photo. The very end of grid 1 contained a very large anomaly that fit dimensions that seemed the most promising. It showed a surface disturbance down to the anomaly. The size and depth fit the size of a clandestine burial, he said. Does this suggest that the soil had been dug out and refilled? And Haynes replied, that's a possibility. The size of the anomaly we heard was about 6 feet by 4 feet with a depth down to about 4 feet. He marked the location of the anomaly in grid 1 to be excavated the following day using orange chalk spray. This is grid 1 under the left side of the deck, 36 feet by 5 feet, showing mostly blue area. That shows there's mostly no disturbance there. Towards the top end, the colours change green to yellow to orange to red, which shows heavy disturbance to a 6 foot by 4 foot area. Jurors asked some questions at this point as well. How far underneath the ground can the radar machine study soil? Whether ground-penetrating radar could also detect fluids? And what about the need to recalibrate the machine? Apparently the machine is self-calibrating in each environment, so the unit itself requires very little maintenance, he responded. The heavy lifting is done by the software. And the fluids would be detected if they'd contributed to a change in the consistency of the soil. Sanger, for the defence, took his usual stance of attacking the credentials of the professionals. He started off, "You're a professional archaeologist with a bachelor's degree in anthropology, correct?" Haynes replied, "Correct." "But you're not an academic archaeologist?" "That's also correct." Sanger does like to undermine credentials or qualifications of the experts, doesn't he? He gets Haynes to admit that all the data is approximate and asked him how many investigations he'd done, which was about 10 to 15. And Haynes had been paid about $4,000 for his work on the case so far. Misick established with him that dirt was taken out and redeposited at some point, but there's no way to know when that took place, he was asked. No, that's all I need, Your Honour, Misick responded. Haynes, under cross-examination, also made the point that another slight anomaly found at Ruben's home was near some avocado trees, but their assessment was that the disturbance was likely caused by mature tree roots. Well, that was it for the week until Thursday evening, and I shall catch up with Friday's testimony next week. I hope you've found this informative, and if you have, a like and a subscribe would be greatly appreciated. Until next week then, bye for now.